Hi, David. Hi, it's great to see you.
Thank you.
Let's introduce ourselves to our audience. My name is Gabriel Schaff. I'm a violinist in the Stamford Symphony. And this is my friend and colleague, David Kaplan, who is one of the foremost pianists of his generation. And we're really excited to have the opportunity to hear him, although not in the concert hall due to our current circumstances, but we're going to hear him today in performance, a live performance from his home of Beethoven Sonata number 31, Opus 110. And before we begin, David, I have a couple questions for you, and I'd like to just give our audience a quick sense of what they're about to hear in this piece. Can you tell us why you've chosen 110?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you for having me. Thanks to you for hosting this and to the Stamford Symphony for making this possible. Of course, the reason that this all came about is that Russell and I cooked up the idea of allowing audience members the opportunity to vote on their favorite Beethoven Sonata and to have it played in a concert along with two others. The audience voted for the Pathétique Sonata, Opus 13, a really amazing, trailblazing early sonata by Beethoven that I think lives up to its name. I decided to play one of the other two pieces that I had planned for the program because I would love to save that Opus 13 for an eventual live concert with all of you in person. So I wanted to give you just something else from the program. The reason I chose Opus 110, which is really from the complete other side of the spectrum in terms of Beethoven's life and his style of writing, is that I felt that the piece presents or lends itself to a narrative of darkness into light, if you will, that it portrays, if you're willing to hear it this way, a kind of rebirth. And I thought that at this particular time where so many of us are more isolated than we normally would be, then this sonata provides a little bit of, I think, an analog with what some of us are going through.
Great and fascinating too. So we'll be hearing the sonata in its entirety, and it is in, as I came up in some of my readings, one can interpret it as being in either 3 or 4 movements, but let's just call it 3 movements, and they're very closely linked to each other, but the exploration of moods and emotions is vastly different between them. So the first movement we will hear is molto cantabile, and Beethoven uses the term amabilita, con amabilita, which means gently, basically. That movement is followed by a very interesting and curious scherzo movement, very fast time, which we will talk about later because it's actually a lot of fun to talk about the genesis of that second movement, that scherzo, which is full of sarcasm and humor and all sorts of blustering around, not nearly as dark as one might hear it on the first time. And then the third movement is actually a series of, it's a slow movement, an introduction to an arioso, a sad, I think it's arioso dolente, he calls it, that is then followed by a fugue. And after that presentation of this grand Beethoven fugue, he comes back to the arioso dolente again, even more dolente, even deeper and sadder. And in the final section, he returns to the fugue, this time turning the fugue upside down, just the way Bach would have, to end with an amazing, flourishing, positive finish. So without further ado, we will come back to you after David's performance.
Thank you.
Welcome back, and thank you for that astonishing performance of this masterpiece of Beethoven's late period Sonata number 31, Opus 110. How did it feel?
Well, playing a Beethoven sonata, this one in particular, should feel a little cathartic. You know, there's a lot of drive built into the music and a lot of unity across the expanse of musical time. So it's always like riding a wave.
Hmm. How often have you played the sonata in the past?
Well, as a matter of fact, I worked on this piece I first worked on it about 15 years ago, and worked on it over a long period of time then, but I can only recall performing it once. And in the ensuing time, so in about the ensuing decade, I haven't played it in public. So this is the first performance. The concert that was meant to have happened May 3rd was to have been the first time I was playing it in quite a long time. And so I can, you know, there's lots of different ways for a pianist of learning some of these, you know, iconic repertoire pieces. There's no way that you can get to everything in your life, but you know, as you decide what to work on next, there's always this, there's a lot of variety in the approach. And sometimes, you know, you play something because you're asked to play it, and then, you know, you might learn it very quickly, and you might, it might be a kind of a streamlined, efficient process that has a clear goal in mind. And then sometimes you take little nibbles at a piece over a long period of time. And this is the example of that, where just slowly taking, you know, allowing something to simmer and then going back to it. And it's a bit of a braise rather than a sear.
And what's fascinating, being a musician, that we can share with our audience, is that when you learn a piece for the first time, or you perform it for the first time, and the 10th time, and the 100th time, if it is a great work of art, you never want to just go back to that previous performance as being good enough. That a piece like this is constantly begging us, even as an audience member, as a listening audience member, it's begging me to re-involve myself with the music, because there's so much depth, there's so much richness, and it's so universal in that it's not only Beethoven speaking to us at the end of 1821 when he finished composing the piece, but it's something far greater and far more timeless.
Yeah, you know, I that resonates a lot with me, and actually it was the teacher of my teacher, whom I admire so much for his performances, that being Arthur Schnabel, said that there's no piece of music worth working on if it's not greater than you could ever possibly play it. You know, so that really, of course, defines his extreme humility with regard to music. But that's I think a good litmus test. You know, is it worth spending this much time on a piece of music?
Yes. My mother, who is also a musician, used to say, if you accomplish your goals, you haven't set them high enough.
That's good too. I like that. Yeah.
Well, let's talk about the piece.
Sounds like an intense childhood.
It's for another video, for a more confessional video.
Okay.
Let's talk about the piece in its specifics. The mood of that first movement is so friendly. Well, it doesn't drag us in. It's not like the next sonata, the last sonata, Opus 111, where it's like Zeus throwing thunderbolts at you from the beginning. This is, welcome, come here. I have something soft and gentle to tell you and to share with you. And it's fascinating to visit Beethoven's mindset of the struggles that he endured throughout most of his life, particularly the second half of his life. And to begin a sonata this way, what is your mindset when you begin playing that first movement?
Well, you know, I think that one of the amazing things about just about any Beethoven sonata I can think of, but in particular this one, is the range of musical topics that are combined together in one unified sweep. So what I mean by musical topics is, you know, are we representing symphony? Are we representing opera? Are we representing string quartet, chamber music? Is it song? Is it is it dance music, right? So these are the sort of functional musical categories that get wrapped up in an abstract piece of music. In the case of this Sonata 110, I think he's more focused in the church than with some of his other pieces. And so when we begin the first movement, we're really beginning a kind of a chorale and a hymn. So there's something prayerful about the opening and about the piece in general, but I think he establishes that tone right from the first chords.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it has such a smoothness and flexibility when all the right hand figurations begin on the right hand and go down into the bass and comes back and forth. And I'm always astonished that even when he hints at profundity, there still is this control, of gentle control that he has throughout that first movement.
Yeah, it never gets aggressive, ever. It gets powerful and grand, but never aggressive, and that's a key aspect of this sonata relative to others. And you mentioned Opus 111, which I hope everyone in the audience has an opportunity to hear. And I think you said Zeus throwing thunderbolts. That's just exactly the right metaphor for the opening. So that's you know, it's really diametrically opposed to the lyrical character that that pervades the A flat major sonata.
Yes.
And you also mentioned a sort of a contrast. You're hinting at a contrast, but you were talking about right hand filigree. And from the very first moment I started studying this piece, then what came across to me was a kind of a battle maybe between, or working out at least, between the individual and the collective. And I think that those two ideas are represented by the chordal material, the hymns, the chorales, and rhythmic structure. And then on the other side, a high degree of fantasy and freedom, which usually gets expressed by a kind of a freewheeling right hand. So throughout the piece, you hear, especially in the first movement, you're hearing this improvised sounding right hand that often breaks tempo and breaks the pulse, versus a more structured chordal general texture. And that's clearly an individual versus collective. I hate to use words like this, but dialectic, you know, it's, so you see that kind of continue throughout. And in a way, the third movement, which juxtaposes aria, the most essential kind of individual expression music, versus fugue, juxtaposes those two things. And fugue being the absolute epitome of equality in music making, that you have a number of voices which are all saying the same thing with equal importance and equal weight. So that individual versus the collective relationship, I think permeates the whole work.
Mm-hmm. One thing I find fascinating about how Beethoven's creations lie within the timeline of his life and the daily events of his life is that Beethoven seems to write some of his most gentle and thankful music after he has gone through extreme adversity. In this case, the case of this piece, he had a terrible year. This piece was finished in December of 1821, and through the winter of 1820 into 21, Beethoven suffered from many, many weeks of rheumatic fever. And once he recovered from that in the spring, then he came down with a case of jaundice. So his health, and we can take that maybe as, we can spin that to a degree that we collectively as an earthly society are now suffering from an illness that, thank God, has not plagued all of us. But Beethoven's way of dealing with that type of adversity, the ill health, the things that you can do very little about, are to express thankfulness and lightness upon recovery.
And all the more you have that with the late quartets, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The hymn of thanksgiving in Opus 132. Let's move on to the second movement, because it is not an aberration of Beethoven's style or his mindset. It is as Beethoven as any of these other movements. And as someone who's never researched very deeply this piece, but has listened to it and loved it for many years, I was astonished to find out a few things about it. I mean, there is an element of sarcasm. There certainly is an element of humor when you get to the middle section of it with all this jumping around. But do you want to talk about the materials that are used in it, or
yeah, well, I guess there's some debate, associating meaning and music too closely can be misleading or dangerous. I mean, I think the essential fact of that sarcastic sounding scherzo is its musical contrast, and it's kind of a release of aggression that happens in the middle of this incredibly docile overall structure. So that's its essential fact. But yeah, there's this incredible origin story for the material, which is in Gassenauer, in popular song or in folk song, and the lyrics are kind of lewd and highly they're really with strong dialect, and they have nothing to do with the extremely high tone of the rest of the piece, right? So there is this origin. You were telling me about the fact that he had originally jotted down that tune as a letter, as a kind of a screw you letter to his publisher, in response to a bill that they sent for postage. So that what I had known was simply that the song in its first association with Beethoven predated this sonata significantly, so that the possibilities for direct association between the songs and the sonata were thin, but in other words, that the material as a song, Beethoven had already absorbed it and used it, and so it was sort of fair game for him as just raw musical material. In any case, the lyrics of the song, which are about cats procreating, I have little, if anything, to do with the sort of more emotional program of the piece, but they do show this sort of bawdy side of Beethoven.
Yeah, bawdy and humorous.
Yeah,
and not afraid to say something different. He's
right.
I often think about just in a more general sense that when you look at lists of who was writing music during the classical era, during this period of when Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven were composing, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of composers who are writing music. And what sets it off is that so many of those composers are so slavishly following the rules. And if you follow the rules too closely, then you sort of lose a little bit of your individuality. Whereas Beethoven, is still following the rules. He has great respect for rules, and but he is able to interject other aspects of his life. He doesn't segregate the different components of his life, even humorous things. And he was well known for making humorous remarks. These two particular songs that are alluded to and that I feel do show up in their rhythmic sense. The first one about the cats, ba-da-ba-ba-ba-ba-ba. He uses that rhythm, which is from what he actually scribbled out and sent to his publisher. And then the second one, Ich bin Luderlich, is essentially meaning I am slovenly and so are you.
Yeah.
And that's the second part of the first section. Ba-ba-ba-da-da,
So right. You can tell from that prosody where the beat is supposed to be.
Yes. Yes. Let's briefly explore the third movement, which is so expansive and so deep in emotion, and its structure is amazing. It's essentially two parts. It's a slow movement followed by the first introduction of the fugue, which one could consider the finale, the last movement, and then he comes back to it. He does that a little earlier in the Fifth Symphony, where he begins the Scherzo movement of the Fifth Symphony, then morphs into the finale, but then comes back to it. So this sort of extra structure is fascinating, and I don't think, with the possible exception of in a Mozart opera, I don't think we've seen this kind of return and revisiting, as almost as if I've given you everything emotional. I've given you my vision of humanity, but rather than end it, I'm going to go back and I'm going to explore it even further. Beethoven leaves no details unexplored.
No, it's definitely a sort of an antecedent for formal procedures that get picked up much later in music history. So if I think about some pieces by Brahms, but even most of Mahler, then this kind of cyclic form where whole sections of music are reduced to just whole formal sections are reduced to just brief mentions, and then other things get telescoped or bloomed out of proportion. And that's kind of what Beethoven is doing. I mean, the piece should end before that little that repetition that happens. So you've got a recitative and aria, and then you have the fugue, and that really that would, as you talk about following the rules in the way of maybe a still genius but lesser composer, not one who isn't unique in the way that Beethoven or Mozart or Haydn each were, then the piece really should finish in A flat major, where there's this climactic fugue. It really it could easily be done there, but and
it would still be Beethoven. It would still be good Beethoven.
It would still be fine. It would be absolutely fine. It would be a little short, but it would be fine. But what Beethoven does is he takes a wrong turn on purpose.
Yeah.
And it's this, again, going back to this idea of the individual versus the collective. At the climax of the power of the collective, this A flat major fugue, where in a fugue everybody's equal and it's the main key of the piece, then the fallibility of that structure is revealed by this improvisatory turn into a very distant key, a minor key that is unrelated. That has to be climbed out of with tooth and nail. And so we're plunged back into the original material, but now that the slow material, the aria and the recitative material, but now that material has been just manipulated so slightly with more breathless rests like this, as if we're gasping for breath. And it really recalls what you talked about in terms of Beethoven's
Cavatina.
biographical circumstances. Well, the
Mhm.
cavatina, but the fact of illness. I mean, it really calls to mind very viscerally the kind of um, gasping for air. You know, maybe it's just the current circumstance that makes me make that association. But but in any case, desperation or gasping is part of that musical landscape, and then the affect that we feel as a result. Um, so he returns to an even darker place, and gosh, how is he going to get out?
Yes.
As you already pointed out, then he takes that fugue subject, which, by the way, the fugue subject is uh, really the theme, the first theme of the first movement, sort of distilled. So he takes the melody line, which is sort of rising intervals, and then a gentle descent down, and he distills that into its just tones, intervals, no rhythmic variety, no nothing, no harmony, no nothing, and that's the fugue subject, right? So he takes that fugue subject, turns it upside down, and obscures it in color. Tells us Beethoven was one of the first composers to use extensive use of pedal markings. He
Hmm.
wasn't the first, but he was one of the first. And there's about 600 pedal indications in Beethoven's piano music, many of which pertain not just to the sustain pedal, the right-hand pedal, but to what was called the shift pedal, what we today we call the una corda pedal, the left-hand one,
Hmm.
which basically makes the piano a little bit muted or a little softer. At one time, it was by having the hammers strike one string per note instead of two or three, and that's why it's called the una corda, one string. But now it's a little more complex than that, and I I risk boring you by telling you how it works, but it creates another color altogether. So Beethoven obscures this upside down theme a little bit with that magical una corda color, and then instructs you to slowly bring that pedal up so that you climb slowly into light again. And he really turns on a dime, bringing us back into A flat major, bringing us back into the main key. And before you know it, the piece is done. It really accelerates to the finish.
Yes. Yes. How extraordinary is it that a a man who was profoundly deaf by this point was able to clearly elucidate his desire to have so many different colors and qualities of sound in his music. Um, in a way, it seems almost as if his deafness could be construed as not a disability at all. It allowed him the space in his to see in his imagination all these different varieties. He does the same thing in the string quartet, the late string quartet writing, by making all sorts of things very clear in sotto voce and all different types of qualities of sound. It's astonishing. I was noticing that in the pedal markings online. One can download a copy of the manuscript of this piece,
Mm-hmm,
and
mm-hmm.
I've always found it fascinating to look at the composer's original intention.
Mm-hmm.
Their handwriting, you know, does that slur actually go all over? Is it a dot or is it a wedge? Where is that piano? Under which note is it? These little details, they're of no interest, and they should not be of any interest to the audience. But for us, when in preparing a piece, that's the only way we can truly connect with the composer, and to own the details of it, to take all these thousands of little pieces of details and turn it into something that is in fact a living representation
Right.
of that composer's idea.
Yeah, as one of my old teachers said, that the ink was expensive. You know, lots of intent and process. And Beethoven's particularly interesting because of this, because we have a lot of sketchbooks, and so there's a chance to see his working out of material, um, over time and to what changed. Is a lot of times in his manuscripts, including this one, then there's just vast tracts of material that are crossed out. And for me, that's the most fascinating thing, is to look at what did he decide not to do, you know, because there's a lot of pretty good material. There's a lot of pretty good stuff, you know, and at the same time, then there's, you can kind of, you can sympathize with him why he's crossed something out. You can say, oh yeah, you know, that's a little bit hard-edged, or that's a little bit clumsy, or there's just sometimes where you can see the idea through what's written, but it's not quite as refined as what's going to happen eventually.
Well, the only thing better than this is going to be to hear you play the actual full recital live with all of us in the audience there. So can you tell us what is going to be on that program?
Well, you know, having played now 110 for you in this context, then I have to consider playing, I have to at least consider playing a different sonata when we play the actual concert. So I don't know yet whether 110 will figure in again, but I had planned to play one sonata from each of the 3 periods. And my plan was to play one of the big middle period heroic sonatas, and I can't remember now, since it's been several weeks since we knew this concert was not going to happen. I can't remember now if we were going to play Waldstein or Appassionata, but it was going to be one of those 2 real blockbusters.
Yes.
And then the early Pathétique sonata.
If you weren't going to play this A flat, what would you?
Well, I'd want to play really one of maybe the last 4 or 5 sonatas. So that's you know, either 111, which you mentioned is the Zeus Thunderbolts, the 110, which is a little bit of Visit to Church, 109, which is more pastoral. It's more it's certainly very intimate, and but it's maybe a little bit more vernacular than the original Latin, and if that makes any sense. And then there's 106, Summer Clavier, which is possible too, and maybe 101, which is also a very special sonata, and maybe in some ways a little bit of a presage of all that's to come in the late style of piano writing. So we'll just have to see.
Yeah, well, it's exciting. It's a living, breathing creation of performances, and we're all going to look forward to being there when it's safe to come out. So,
well, thank you for this conversation, and thank you all for having me. It's been a pleasure.
and thank you to our audience. Thank you, David Kaplan. I'm Gabriel Schaff, signing off for now. Bye.